Welcome to Resiliency, the podcast, the place to find stories, strategies, and inspiration to help you embrace change, overcome challenges, and redefine resilience in today's ever-evolving world. I am Jenn Quader. I'm a strategic communications expert and CEO of a company called The Smart Agency. I am joined by my brilliant co-host, the world's first doctor of resiliency, Dr. Kelly Culver. She is an international business consultant and works through her firm, the Culver Group, and she's also a widely respected expert and researcher in the field of resilience. Our show brings together diverse, intelligent, and wonderful guests from all over the world who share their experiences to help inspire, educate, and motivate our listeners to find their own inner strength in everything from the minutiae of everyday life to world-altering problems. Today, we are honored, excited, beside ourselves, and already dancing to welcome a wonderful, wonderful guest that we met at the TEDx series at the American University of Paris. Today's guest is a modern-day Renaissance man. Mr. Ira McIntosh holds a master's and bachelor's in opera performance and has spent the last decade as a drag performer in Seattle and New York City. He is currently pursuing another master's degree at the American University of Paris in global communications, and his goal is to have a future as a queer historian and to work through academia and communications to find a use for social media as a tool for gathering historical information. Please join me in welcoming the great, the wonderful, the very talented Mr. Ira McIntosh.
Hello! How is everyone today?
We're so excited.
We are ready to rock and roll and resilify. Is that a word?
Yeah,
Can we resilify
sure.
today?
It's a word now.
Yeah.
Ira, we want to know something.
Yes.
So this is a global podcast. Jen's in the States. I'm in Canada. Where in the world are you and what time of day is it?
Where in the world is Carmen San Diego? I'm
Yes.
had to throw some 90s in. I am currently in Paris, where I am finishing up classwork for my master's degree. Just had my first meeting with my thesis advisor to get that off the ground. I have a giant notebook of research behind me. So yes, I am residing in Paris, France, which is not something I ever thought I would say.
Can I ask what brought you to Paris? You know, look, you were performing in Seattle and New York City. You're obviously really well-trained in opera and beautiful performance. What brought you to Paris?
So Paris was a little bit of a fluke. I had moved to New York out of Seattle because I'd grown up in Seattle. I'd lived there almost 28 years of my life. I just was done with the West Coast. I needed something new. I was at my Saturn's return. It just was time for change. And I moved to New York thinking it's going to be the big city. It's bright lights of Broadway. It's going to be exciting. And I got there and I was like, oh no, what did I do to myself? This was not what I expected.
Oh, yeah.
Was working 3 jobs at a time. It was an insane experience. It taught me a lot, but it was not something that I knew I wanted to live in for the long term. So I knew I wanted to leave the US. I wanted to get out. And I applied to a bunch of schools in the UK and randomly ran across AUP's website and was like, wait, this sounds interesting, because I hadn't thought about communications prior to that, and ended up having a Zoom call with the head of the program at the time. And from what she told me and from the opportunities that would be possible after the degree, I said, sign me up, sent in my application, and got in and uprooted my life yet again and moved to Paris.
Congratulations. What a bold and brave step that demonstrates a lot of resiliency.
Yeah, but it's fun.
Brave is one word for it.
It's fun, you know.
Yes.
So one of the things
Yes.
about resilience is like you can channel your inner explorer. You can channel your inner adventurer. It's like you're the captain of your own ship, and you're doing that.
I mean, maybe more of a captain of my own raft, but
Oh no, you gotta ship. You gotta ship. You gotta ship.
Look, if it's a raft, it's like the glamping version of a raft.
Exactly.
Okay, Ira, come on. You know what I mean? This is high level.
I don't know who here is a Katharine Hepburn fan, but it's definitely the African Queen.
Oh, it is
just
not.
putting down the river, giving a swift kick every now and then in the engine.
Look, if it gets us where we're going, we can raft it all the way there. It's all good.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. Oh my goodness me.
I want to talk a little. We're going to get into your TEDx talk. That's something we're going to share. But I wonder if we're going to do something a little different. And I want to actually I want to have you talk for a moment about what brought you to this, because this is your thesis that you're building, and you edited that and transitioned it into a really powerful TEDx talk. The title of your talk is Queerness Beyond Trauma. Where is our history? And I wonder if you can give us a little history as to what drove you to this topic and why it is so important before we share with our listeners all that you're going to share today.
The topic kind of came from a long lifetime of figuring out who exactly I was. I grew up in a fairly conservative home. It was in Seattle, so I was surrounded by a fairly liberal, progressive community. But I also grew up going to church 4 times a week and being in Bible study and Awana and Bible quizzing. I was memorizing whole books of the Bible and didn't feel any kind of a connection to a real community at all in my life. One of the things that I've kind of been interested in pursuing is figuring out how community is built, where community comes from, and how people are able to tap into community, especially in today's day and age where we are living more and more of our lives online. What creates the boundaries of a singular community when those boundaries are not physical in any way, shape, or form? And then on top of that, I've just been grappling with the fact that the queer community has no codified history. We don't have history books. In fact, a lot of the world is trying to make sure those books don't get written. And so there are all these kind of legends, and there's so much lore and just hearsay surrounding queer history. And so those two kind of desires in my life came together during my first semester at AUP. We were required to do a project where we interviewed people, and it had to be something about communications. And I was like, well, what if I interviewed queer millennials just to see what it was like to be out on the internet in the early 2000s? And so I got a few interviews for that and started really digging into this idea of what it was like to be online, how anonymity could work for people, how to find people to talk to and learn from when you aren't necessarily able to act out your truth in reality. And that just kind of took me down this road and grabbed me and said, here's where we're going. And the snowball kept snowballing and getting bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. And so now I've kind of opened that up a little bit more to discovering exactly how we find each other's stories and how we figure out community, and how do we decide what is real and what isn't, which I think is the whole question with history. Like, how do you teach history when you weren't there? And so my thesis now has grown into this topic of exploring the idea of gossip and how gossip is utilized on the internet to create those boundaries for community and to share truth. So rather than being this negative force of tearing people down, what are the positive aspects of gossiping and telling people, oh, this person is safe. This blog is a safe place to talk. This website is a safe place to post images. Here are the things that you can put in your images that we know within the community are things that show that you are also queer and are a safe place and are someone that's part of this. So it's a whole lot of different puzzle pieces that all just kind of click together in a way that I never thought they would. And it's been really exciting to let my research take me along the journey with it.
You've just said something that is so interesting to me. It's this juxtaposition between the concept of gossip and positivity. There's a positivity can come out of understanding gossip in a different way and being able to dive into a space that is safe. Because you've talked about a history that isn't written, or if it is written, it's difficult to find that light's under the bushel.
Absolutely. Especially when you live in a society that teaches you that you have to be in a closet, that you're not allowed to be out there talking openly. Yep. And I mean, there are conversations to be had about lavender linguistics, like the languages that have grown out of that closeted nature, that there are entire lexicons and grammars that have grown up alongside queer people and being able to talk to each other. There's the hanky code. There are all sorts of ways that queer people have found to communicate with each other in safe ways to find those people that they're okay to talk to about certain things and not get arrested or get killed.
To me, I'm so fascinated by this concept of growing up and not being able to find a community to ask, hey, what is this feeling I'm having? What is this thing I'm experiencing? You know, again, citing and recognizing my own privilege in kind of how I grew up. You know, I grew up going to girl slumber parties and being able to talk about all those things very openly. And so it really, I want to commend the research you're doing because, and Dr. Culver and I talk about this a lot, community is such a critical element of resilience. There's a collectiveness that's needed. So I think I want to ask you, Ira, before we get into your talk, how has your perception on, let's say, the queer community or really any community that supports you, how has that perception changed from the beginning of this as you were growing into it to now where you see all of these different pathways?
You know, I think I'm starting to be able to see my community in a much more complex light. I wasn't really integrated into the queer community until after my first master's degree. So I was 24 when I really was letting myself come out and go to gay bars and get started in drag. I started drag at the same time that I came out, basically. And I used it as a way to start conversations because I'm a very introverted person naturally. So being able to put on a costume and makeup and basically be a clown or another character gave me a way to talk to people that I didn't know. And so that really colored my perception of my community because I came into it already defensive. And I think that's a very common experience for queer people, that we grow up defensive. So we come to our community defensive and expect our community to hate us because everyone else has. So why wouldn't they? And so I think by taking a step back and looking at things a little bit more objectively and looking at it from a historical standpoint and seeing this constant movement forward, I've been able to contextualize some of those conversations and relationships that I've had and be like, no, I don't think they hated me. We just didn't know how to talk to each other. And we were using characters that we'd created, literal facades to communicate rather than being able to sit and actually have a conversation. And that's a huge movement that's happening in the queer community right now, especially around the idea of sober spaces, because a lot of places that are safe for queer people to be queer are places that revolve around alcohol and drugs and dancing, and not that dancing is unhealthy, but that kind of dancing, and that sort of escapism. And finding new places to come together as a community where we can have sober conversations with each other and be able to have intergenerational conversations where we're not drunk off our minds expecting that everyone wants to sleep with us. So it's definitely, getting back to your question, it definitely has allowed me to take a spectator's position for a moment and reevaluate my own positioning within my community and grant some grace to the people that I've had interactions with and understand that they're coming to it with the same baggage that I'm coming to it.
Or seeing through the disguise. I think what you've just described is being able to see through the disguise.
Absolutely.
And that's a journey too.
Both literal and figurative.
Exactly. Because you talk about, one of the questions I haven't asked anybody yet, and I will at some point in time, is like, if resilience is your superpower, what's your superhero costume look like? But that's not what you mean.
Lots of latex.
I was going to say, I need to know what Ira's is.
Okay.
Yeah.
Awesome. Okay, I'm going to ask you another question. Lots of latex. We like to ask people, what does resilience mean to you?
In the famous words of the now truly famous crossover artist Jinx Monsoon, water off a duck's back.
I love it.
Realizing that a lot of things that are done to us and a lot of things that are said to us, whether we're queer or not, just as humans, come from a place of self-disgust rather than disgust of you. So people are reflecting themselves onto you when they're talking to you. So if someone comes to you with hatred and with malice and with things that they don't like about you, they're just talking about how they don't like themselves and how they have malice towards themselves. And that's really been something that's helped me. Now that I'm in my 30s, I have gotten to a point where I realize that I can't expect other people to have a true picture of who I am, because I don't have a true picture of who I am. And so if someone is coming to me with issues they have with me, there are valid things that people can come to me with, but the things that someone might say to me on the subway or walking down the street or on a YouTube comment or something like that is just going to be a reflection of themselves and what they don't like about themselves. And that has really allowed me to let everything just kind of fly off into the wind. It's not something that I have to deal with. It's not my circus. Let you go deal with your own things. I have my own things. We're good. Have a great rest of your day.
I love the analogy.
Yeah, me too. I see that little duck, and actually, as I see the water flying off his back, I see his little legs going underneath, just swimming forward, which I think is so important. Because there's that concept of letting go of what people say and not attaching yourself to it. And then there's that concept of moving forward, of finding these communities, as you're saying, carving new places, sober communities, places that perhaps the queer community could not be themselves in the past, but finding that. Again, before we get into your talk, which is just packed with data and information, and I'm really excited to get to it. But I want to ask, just, you brought in a lot of really amazing concepts, and they come from your own personal history of you growing up in Seattle, moving to New York, now moving to Paris, doing all of this research. And you brought up a really interesting concept, I think, in what you said was self-disgust. And I think the lens you talked about that was the people who may say hateful things. They're sharing their own disgust, and that can be let go, like water off the duck. But I think there is an element to be talked about that affects resilience for a young queer person who's growing up, that they might feel an element of self-disgust because they cannot find themselves in another. They can't find their community. They think that what they feel is wrong based upon something they were taught. What I want to ask you today is, what would you say to that young person today that might feel that?
I think the thing that got me through a lot of that is, like I said earlier, I came from a very Christian background, so I was reading the Bible a lot. I think, honestly, queers who grew up in the church have read the Bible more than most other people, including pastors, just because we're bombarded with information saying that we're not okay and that it's evil and it's a sin. So we're looking through it for those answers. And one of my favorite books of the Bible, and I don't think anyone ever will or has said this, is Ecclesiastes. And it's the most depressing book of the Bible. It was written by King Solomon. It's a bunch of poetry, and it's literally him. There's a verse in like chapter 4 or 5 where he says, meaningless, meaningless, everything is meaningless. And it's if you've ever heard the old song, Turn, 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 to everything there's a season, turn, turn, turn. that's from Ecclesiastes as well. So it's this idea that whatever you're going through, A, has already been gone through billions of times before you, and B, it's just a season. It's just a short time that you're going to be dealing with this, and there's going to be the next thing soon. And it doesn't mean that the next thing is always going to be sunshine and rainbows, but it means that you are building tools now, and then you might be building different tools in the next month or two. And that was something that I just kept clinging to over and over, especially in my teenage years, was just deal with it, just move through it, and eventually it'll be something new, and there'll be something that you've learned from what you're going through now that's going to help you in the next stage. So that's what I would say is nothing's new, and it will always change.
So beautiful, because, change can be stressful, but it's often quite a relief. Change is something that keeps us moving forward. And I had a visual as you were talking. Dr. Culver and I have talked with another guest who equated resilience to a willow tree that stands during the storm. I would take that same willow tree and say, every tree, if you drive by a row of trees, when winter comes, those leaves are gone. And they are bare, and then there is that rebirth, and that does happen over and over. So I think what you're saying is really important. And it's a great kickoff to bring our listeners into your TEDx, where, again, you are going to give us some really important information about how we are viewing queer history and about where people who are navigating this can begin to find themselves in the online world. So I would like to invite our listeners that we are about to play Mr. Ira McIntosh's wonderful TEDx talk, and I will remind you to please stay tuned, because as soon as it's over, we're going to dive into a deep discussion about some of the things that he's talking about. So without further ado, I give you Ira McIntosh's beautiful and wonderful TEDx talk entitled Queerness Beyond Trauma, Where is Our History?
Once upon a time. Queer people love these words. Whether we're in it for the villains or the heroes, the princesses or Prince Charming, something about those 4 words causes something deep within us to leap for joy. We're about to hear a story. As humans, we love to hear stories about ourselves. We love to tell stories about ourselves. Even if ourselves don't actually wear tiaras or have wings or breathe fire. Fairy tales begin to fail us as we get older, however. Unless you're a Disney adult, you don't really think about these stories as much. So how do we satisfy our need for fairy tales? Who tells us our stories? I was recently discussing the topic of social media with one of my friends and whether or not it has any positive merits. During the course of this conversation, they said something that made me pause. We live in a reality where social media exists and puts us under a microscope to whatever capacity we have signed up for. We create history books on ourselves through social media. We live in an age where not only do we have the pleasure as a general populace of listening to stories from our past, but we also have the privilege of writing down our own stories for the future. But before we had social media, how was history codified? My background is in music, so I immediately have to think of someone who's considered to be the forefather of ethnomusicology, Bela Bartok. A brilliant composer in his own right, he took to the road to copy down and digest folk music so it wouldn't be lost. He took an active role in his community, hearing stories, writing them down, publishing books and tomes and volumes of tunes that were previously known only to a small portion of the world. These melodies were then able to be disseminated across the globe, leading to a surge in scholarship. Let's pause for a moment and zoom in on Bartok. He was a Hungarian composer who had made a name for himself by his early 20s composing completely original music. Even though he was successful, he felt there was something missing. He knew there had to be more than simply following the set rules of music theory and writing original melodies over and over again. He was introduced to folk music by another Hungarian composer, Zoltán Kodály, who gave him a phonograph and encouraged him to record this music. Something awoke in Bartók, and he spent his days traveling all over the countryside, writing down music, interviewing the people who sang the music, and becoming part of the culture. But he didn't stop there. He then went home and began to use what he had learned. He began incorporating these folk tunes in his grander compositions, interweaving larger theoretical ideas with these seemingly simplistic rural melodies and harmonies. This opened a new door not only for his own work, but also for the rest of the world to hear and appreciate something new, all growing together in knowledge. Ethnography is one of the most important avenues for historical data collection, going out into the world, joining communities, meeting them where they are, and writing down their stories. There are many ways to verify information, but this is where history begins, with the people who experienced it. We can come across these stories in many different ways, via interviews, novels, letters, recordings, even photographs and paintings. Any form of human communication can be collated and constructed into viable history. This brings me to the concept of grafting. I grew up in the United States, in Washington State, the far northwesternmost corner. And we're known for a lot of things. Starbucks, Microsoft, Nirvana, but our main export is apples. Now, if you've never had the chance to go apple picking or talk to an apple farmer, give me a moment to tell you my favorite fact about apple trees. Apple trees don't have to bear all the same kind of fruit. Well, that's a lie. They all have to bear apples, but it doesn't have to be the same kind of apple. In fact, it's common practice for apple farmers to graft multiple types of apples onto the same tree trunk. This allows you to have multiple flavors and uses of apples all in one place. Some for pies, some for sauce, some for eating whole. Each of these kinds granting their best traits to the rest of the tree, making the tree stronger than it would have been otherwise. Dr. J. Newsom took this idea and ran with it. Currently the foremost author studying World War II era queer history, Newsom proposed this idea of memory grafting following the Holocaust. This concept encapsulates how the queer people of New York City reached out across the Atlantic to gather stories from those who had firsthand experience of the Holocaust and were willing to share those stories, grafting them together into a singular tree of knowledge. The transfer of ideas, memories, and historical information is not static. Understandings of a topic change as they are introduced in a new setting and to new audiences. As we seek to make sense of ourselves and our place in the world, we collect bits and pieces of memories, narratives, and histories, bringing them together into a constant state of reassessment and transformation as we mold the boundaries of our identities. He continues a bit further down the page by saying that the metaphor implies that although memories may originate externally, they ultimately become enmeshed in one's own subjective memory and sense of place in history. That is, we require this grafting to occur in order to better understand our own sense of selves and find our place in the greater tapestry of history. But there comes a risk with this grafting. Sure, we can enmesh the best parts of history into ourselves, but doesn't that also mean we can enmesh the worst parts as well? Who is to say what is important or not, except for the individual? This is the problem of representation in media. When one thinks of queer cinema, one immediately thinks of the AIDS epidemic. We think of works such as Angels in America, Dallas Buyers Club, Philadelphia, films and plays that talk about the queer community in crisis. When one sees oneself represented as a victim, that is the attitude one takes on. We are shown versions of our reality that, however true they may be, ignore the core joys and beauties we see in our everyday lives. Maura Kelly et al. Studied this idea of collective trauma in their October 2020 paper published in Sexuality and Culture. In this study, they were specifically looking at the queer community of Portland, Oregon, and trying to contextualize the effects of collective trauma that had been found in other marginalized groups to determine if these effects held true for the queer community. In the article they wrote, and I'm just going to read the bold parts, these events contributed to tension and disruption within the queer community, ultimately threatening the cohesion of the collective sense of community. Queer people do not often have other queer people in their families of origin. There's a lack of access to intergenerational relationships, and there is a lack of queer spaces. It is due to a lack of safe spaces and intergenerational relationships that we are finding it difficult to deal with the effects of trauma on us as queer individuals. How do we learn if we do not have a tangible connection to our past? How can we cope when those who have come before us are not available to us, either familially or because they were lost to AIDS or Holocausts? What tools can we create for ourselves if we have no blueprints? We are raising consecutive generations of queer individuals who are not being given information about their history past the points of trauma that have so far defined us. Because we cannot see how our queer forebears handled themselves in their daily lives and celebrated with each other during times of triumph, we get embroiled in negativity and anger and begin to see our community as one of infighting and fear. In 2005, Alan Downs wrote a book entitled The Velvet Rage, in which he discusses this idea that shame is a key driving factor in many queer men's lives. We are fiercely protective of our experiences and our stories because we are so used to having to live double lives. Because of this, we inevitably hide our real selves, even from each other, making it even more difficult for younger generations to learn from us, or maybe even more importantly, for us to learn from younger generations. For it is this intergenerational interplay that is required to create community. We were made to live in fear, hiding between the emotional baggage in our closets. We became bitter, choosing to inflict this ennui onto further generations rather than focus on the beautiful parts of being queer. The damaging part of learning to live your life in two parts, whether in reality or fantasy, cannot be underestimated. It is an infectious skill that you learned, one that would eventually spread beyond the bedroom of your life. Life wasn't ever what it seemed to be on the surface. Nothing could be trusted for what it appeared to be. After all, you weren't what you appeared to be. In learning to hide part of yourself, you lost the ability to trust anything or anyone fully. Without knowing it, you traded humane innocence for dry cynicism. Our own internal conflicts prevent us from gaining the emotional clarity needed to maintain a safe and satisfying bond. Working in bars, I'd often hear young men making excuses for not talking to their elders. They would assume they were just going to be hit on, or that they didn't have anything constructive to add to the conversation, and they would just leave well enough alone. This is an example of that distrust, that loss of ability to open oneself to the possibility that someone else might have something important to say. So where then does this leave us? How do we pass on a history when the younger generation doesn't have access to information via their elders? What do we do when we live in a community that has been systematically destroyed, dissected, and disarticulated? We must turn to the media, the thing that seems to be failing us so miserably. We create history books on ourselves and our timelines and through our images and video clips. We go through journals and history books and letters with a fine-tooth comb and reinterpret the mythos of best friends and roommates so that future generations know that they never have to live in the dark again. We have an obligation to our community to curate our online presence to whatever extent possible so that future generations have a clearer picture of those who came before. We have an obligation to future generations to spend the time now to find those historical references, collecting family stories about that estranged uncle or that aunt that lived on the farm with her best friend. We have an obligation to make sure that states passing legislation to keep queer history out of schools are stopped so the coming epic can be one where children grow up knowing that they are part of a bigger story that is worth scholarship. So they don't have to live a double life anymore and lose that oh so important ability to trust. Once upon a time, there was a group of people who loved each other very, very much. And the world seemed to rise up against them, tearing off their wings. So they dusted off their tiaras and went to war breathing fire. Thank you.
Ira. I love that as much today as I did at the end of March, just a couple of months ago. And that imagery at the end, you put on your tiara and breathe fire, and I see the fairy wings and the dust and the swarm, and it's a beautiful, beautiful image. And we talked a bit before the TED Talk. Jen asked you about, wow, this TED Talk was a bit about how you were framing your thesis, and helping you with that. Mm-hmm. So it's been a couple of months since we were all together, a couple of months since you did that phenomenal TED Talk. How has this changed your life?
By the time I was doing this talk, I was really questioning how it is that people become historians, and why it is that people become historians. And honestly, the point at which one can begin to call themselves a historian. And since the talk, I've decided to just embody that idea of being a curator of my history, of taking charge of that history and joining with the people who are actively looking for it. For instance, I referenced Dr. J. Newsom's book in my talk, and I was able to get on a Zoom call with him and discuss his work further and discuss my work a little bit with him as well. I also have, embraced my age a little bit and become a little bit of a TikTok troll as I'm planning my own sorts of content, just trying to find ways to gently nudge truth into those conversations, especially because it's now June. It's Pride Month. There's so many people posting about Stonewall and Marsha P. Johnson and Sylvia Rivera and just all of this queer lore that honestly isn't true and doesn't need to be true for those people to be honored. Something I've had a conversation with many people about is this weird obsession that the queer community seems to have with the idea that you only have some kind of rapport as a queer forebear if you were at Stonewall itself, which there's many issues with that. It completely leaves out the sit-ins, the sip-ins. It leaves out everything that was going on in San Francisco before Stonewall happened. completely leaves out lesbians from the story, because lesbians are a huge part of the story. Stormy Delivery was the first one to actually say, someone do something at Stonewall. Marcia and Sylvia weren't even there. Marcia showed up after the riot happened, and Sylvia was just uptown getting drunk, which isn't a bad thing. That's what drag queens do. Like, that's so I've been able to kind of inhabit this understanding that, especially at my age, I'm now kind of sitting at this crux between generations. It's why my thesis is about millennials. I think it's this real turning point, because we did come of age before social media, but our entire adult lives have been spent on social media. So we have these two disparate ideas that we can look at simultaneously, versus Gen X and the boomers don't necessarily have as much to do with social media in the same ways. And Gen Z and Gen Alpha have only ever known social media. So we sit at this specific place in history where we can look and say, okay, how is all of this information that's being put online, how do these computers that sit in our pockets that give us access to a universe of information, how do we use it to our advantage to get information out? And so I've just been spending the last couple of months, beyond my research, beyond figuring out how Facebook governance works, which is a journey in and of itself, really letting myself believe that I'm a historian and that I have some kind of hold over my own history, that I'm allowed to be a part of it and allowed to help mold it for future generations.
Well, if I can help in any way on that, Ira, I would share with you that you are a historian, and that you're a historian the moment you start telling these stories. And you are doing so in a way that is impactful and strong and out in front of an entire audience, in front of a global world. You know, you're giving a TED Talk about this. You're doing a thesis about this. My side by side Jen and Ira advice would be, you know, they used to say, dress for the job you want, not the one you have. Mm-hmm. And I think, you know, if maybe what you're saying to yourself is, well, I don't know if I can call myself a historian because I don't yet have a paying job that says historian as my title. Make that duck off the water's back. You know what I mean? Because you are. So own that. Now, I want to dive a little bit, looking at you as a historian, looking at you as an expert in this field who is looking at this from a perspective that most people are not, you know. You said something really interesting prior to us airing the TEDx. We were talking about your journey and how when you first began coming out as queer, you went to drag queen, and you talked a little bit about how you did that so you could create a character, and that you yourself were actually a little introverted. And in your talk, you say we hide ourselves even from ourselves. Mm-hmm. And so there is a real challenge to overcome here. And so the question I have for you is, what do you think, from your perspective as a historian, as an expert in this field, what do you think can be done to help the LGBTQ community to be more resilient, to get out of that hiding from themselves, and to be able to be their true selves without that fear?
Fear is a big thing for humans in general, so it's a it's a tough question to deal with. In fact, one of my favorite lines from the musical Rent is when they're at life support, and the person leading the meeting says, "What are you afraid of?" And the guy says, "I'm a New Yorker. Fear is my life." As a former New Yorker, I can tell you that is accurate. But I've been getting questions about recently. I've basically given up doing drag, not as any kind of like personal dilemma or anything, or any kind of drive against it. I do have my issues with it, but that's not what keeps me from doing it. But the reason for that is because I started drag as a way to explore parts of myself that I wasn't allowed to as a male presenting person, especially my femininity. And I think within the queer community, that's something that is a huge point of fear, especially for gay men, is being able to express themselves in a feminine way. In fact, I find it very interesting in studying feminism and post-feminism, and looking into further degrees and further areas of studies. There's a new entire area of study that just became a thing about 10, 12 years ago called the study of masculinities. And it's because there is currently no definition for the word masculine except for that which is not feminine. And so I think that's been a huge driving factor in my life. And for a lot of gay men, there's that shame around, why don't I know how to be masculine? Why can't I be a man? And it's because there's no definition, and B, there's no reason to. But I started drag because I wanted to live into that femininity, and I wanted to create a character that embodied that side of myself that I had no idea how to express. So now I've gotten to this point where I've been able to begin expressing that in my life, and I live that duality daily. And so I don't need the drag character really anymore. Like, she'll be pulled out for special events. I'll probably do something for Pride. If someone wants to pay me, I'll do private events, sure. But she's not something that I need to do weekly or multiple times a week anymore, because I got what I needed from her. She taught me how to be me. And I think that's ultimately what I wish I could impart to other queer people is find ways to explore those parts of yourself that you are not comfortable with, that are safe, like drag, like performing, music. For some people, sports allows them to live into the parts that they aren't comfortable with. Just find something that forces you to live that and allow yourself to learn from it. And you're going to get to the point where it integrates into your life and you're not going to be scared of it anymore.
If you're looking at finding that place that you've just said, go to that place where you can be comfortable, it's almost like allow yourself to be curious about you.
Mm-hmm.
By the time we're 17, the concept of imagination, we have, scientific evidence that says by the time someone hits 17, we have indoctrinated them in how they should think. And they've lost that sense of imagination, wonder, and curiosity. And I think that's just such a shame.
I fully remember having conversations saying, I don't have an imagination anymore. I don't know where it went. Like, this was in my early 20s, just talking to my friends and being like, I used to be able to sit in the corner of a room with like 2 Playmobil characters and just have an endless conversation between the 3 of us. Just not because I was sad or depressed or needed to be by myself, but just because I was living in an imagined universe for a few minutes and letting those things run wild. And then by my early 20s, I just didn't have that anymore. And I was all analytical and completely like one-track minded. So I completely agree with that the world indoctrinates that out of us. We're not taught how to be creative and how to be imaginative. And it's so hard to reteach that to yourself. It's possible, but it's so hard.
Well, and I'd say too, it's hard to reteach it. And it also, we are bucking up against a society that doesn't really want us to have it. And when I look at that through the lens of what I've learned from you, Ira, there's an entire community in the queer community that suffers from and lives in the bitterness and the cynicism. And when there is a community that says, look, you can't be creative and enjoy that because we have to remember these trials and tribulations we've had. And again, it goes back to what your entire speech is about, which is it's so important to tell a history, but how do you tell that history? How do you tell those stories? Because if it's told only through the lens of cynicism and negativity, then how will you find that self-discovery and that imagination, which is so key to resilience? And then being someone who just watched your TED Talk, and I think about you starting it and saying, once upon a time, and you talk about the power of storytelling. And something that I got from your TEDx really in a clear way is, when someone's trying to come out as queer, they don't have anyone they can go ask. They can't just ask their granddad, what was it like to be queer, unless he happened to be queer. You don't have that. So what I visualize, let's say in addition to, because I love everything you've said, and I certainly think the school districts could take some points from that. But in addition to it, I see it as perhaps a private storytelling, communication, PSA type of movement that says, hey, moms out there, the story until 2024 was, hey, when your kid says that they are queer, be open to it. Today's story is be open to it and introduce them to 5 more queer people of all ages. Maybe it's pass it on. What was that old ad campaign? There needs to be some sort of education, because again, I grew up in theater. I've had queer friends and loves my whole life, but I didn't live that experience. And I never thought about, I could call my aunt and ask her, what was it like to be a woman when you're first becoming a woman? And so I think it's such an important thing, even if we pull it out of the chasm of traditional education, to say there's some education that could be done for the parents, for the loved ones, for friends like me who could help to make those connections and help to build community.
Absolutely. And I think to the point of storytelling, that's where it's exciting to see TV shows like Heartstopper on Netflix. I remember, and this is actually what got me to Alan Downs' The Velvet Rage, was watching Heartstopper the first time. I was sitting there angry the whole time, like just expecting the shoe to drop, expecting the mom to not be okay with it, expecting the friends to continue bullying them, expecting him to decide, no, you know what, I'm not actually gay. To heck with this, I'm out. Like expecting all of these things and them never happening, and just getting more and more angry till I got to the end of the season. And I was just like, this is awful. How dare you? This is not my experience. And coming away from it, just becoming so bitter, like you were talking about earlier, that bitterness that we just want to inflict on other people, the like initiation rites almost of I want you to feel as bad as I do in this moment. And then one of my friends was like, it sounds like you need to read this book. And I read it, and it's about that, and about realizing that the things that have been fought for are coming to fruition. And we're seeing our people being accepted in new ways, maybe not the ways that we wanted it to happen, but in new ways. And allowing those changes to happen, not only with baby queers, but also with us, and allowing ourselves to take a breath and say, they don't have to hurt just because I did. And now that they're getting to grow up like this, what can I learn from them in terms of joy? And I think that's what I was talking about in my TED Talk, in terms of what can they learn from us and what can we learn from them. I think that's our job as elder queer people, is to learn joy from younger queer people. The baby gays are out here just having fun and being silly and feminine and ridiculous and looking ridiculous, but so has every generation ever. And you just got to let them and bask in the fun and the joy and the silliness of it as they grow up, and learn to yourself that, guess what? I also can go out and do that now, because they're getting to do that. They're setting an example for us, just like we set an example for them. I don't know if that answered your question, but that's how I feel.
We're all different generations, and we look at the one that's coming up behind us and we say, oh my goodness me. Right. And you're doing that. But you're also, what I'm hearing is this other element of, they're free. They're expressing themselves in a very free way that I didn't do or didn't feel I could or wasn't able to, whatever the context happens to be. And how do I take that, what I observe from them? Because a historian observes. You taught us that with ethnography. You know, a historian observes his or her surroundings and situation. And you're taking that and you're applying it to yourself to say, how do I transform? Looking at what I'm observing them behave.
It's also, we know what childhood looks like for kids who aren't different. That's been documented. We know what that looks like. And now we're starting to get to see what childhood looks like for queer kids. And it's completely new territory. We have no idea what it's looked like because we've never allowed them to be queer when they're children, which I think is where a lot of the fear around, oh no, they're going to make trans kids have sex changes, which isn't happening. And in fact, doctors are saying, don't do that because that's a big decision to make at an early age. But it's realizing, oh yes, all of these things do happen way earlier than we think they do, because up until now, we haven't let people experience these things until they're in their 20s and 30s. And then they're having to go through a secondary adolescence, experiencing their adolescence in their adulthood, which is also not healthy. This is a huge point of change for us because we don't know what queer childhood looks like yet. So we're having to learn that as it happens, which is terrifying because we want to protect them. Every queer person is like, oh no, you're going to go out there and wearing pink and they're going to scream at you. And then we see them go out wearing pink and they're not screamed at. And we're like, wait a second, what? Excuse you?
Hold on.
You have fake nails on and no one cares. Excuse you? So I think that's where it's exciting and it's scary. And that's where some of that trepidation comes from, is we just don't know what it looks like yet. And we're having to let it happen with a watchful eye, but we're having to let it happen so that we can document it. And that's terrifying.
Well, it's so cool that you use the word terrifying because it brings it right back to fear. And I think fear, we've discussed many times on Resiliency, the podcast. It's one of the quick ways to douse your resilience is to jump into that fear pot and swim around in it. You know, and I think it's so interesting because you're correct. The non-different, or however you say, the traditional childhood has been well documented, but it's not only documented, it's scripted and prescripted. Yeah. It's what should you do? And a lot of that comes from fear of what if I'm not? And, I could take this for a moment outside of the queer realm, just for any listeners who don't have that connection, and say, as a young woman, I was told I was supposed to be about a size 6. That never happened for me, and I kept waiting. When am I going to look like those ladies from the Grease the movie, So really through any lens, when there is a societal expectation, and not only an expectation, but a prescription, a young boy should act like this, a young woman should look like this, that is how it is, and that's what you should be. And then what we're talking about is that society itself has started to snip those lines, and we are all rolling within that. So I think that the point I'd make, and I'll drive it back to a question for you, Ira, is as we're in all that change, from your perspective as a historian, and one of the things in your TED Talk that I really loved was you gave every one of us a call to action. You said, look, we are making history and we are telling these stories, and here we have in our hands, in our pockets, these platforms that will let us do it. So my question is, as society changes, as these people have these different experiences, and as we work to build these resilient communities, what can a person like me do? And then separately, what can a person like you do? What can a person within the queer community do on their social media, step by step, to really drive resilience and positivity and get into it? And then what can a non-queer person, but who loves the community and wants to see it thrive, do?
Ooh, I mean, there have been questions about allyship that have been coming up a lot in the last probably decade, since the fight for same-sex marriage, which my thesis is specifically looking at the fight for same-sex marriage, just because you have to have a very specific case study for a thesis. But this question of what does allyship look like? During the pandemic, we saw the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement and how white people trying to figure out how is it that we're supposed to help. Like we saw the blackout of social media and people like, no, that's not, no, don't do that. That's not helping. And just trying anything to help. And the thing that I learned from that and that I still tell people is you don't have to have an opinion on something that you want to get out into public knowledge. So if you see something that deserves to be reposted, you can repost it. You can share it. You can make sure that the people in your lives that need to see it, but you don't have to put your own opinion on it. It doesn't have to be in your words. You can just allow the person who has experienced those things speak. That goes for the queer community, that goes for the Black community, that goes for any minority group or any group that is experiencing repression or oppression. They're the ones who know what's happening. They're the ones who know what they need. So you just need to let them be the ones speaking. As hard as it is sometimes to not put our own spin on it and to not say, yeah, go this is great. Sometimes just hitting that repost. I find myself on TikTok the most often just hitting repost, not commenting on something, just repost. Because it's the more those get reposted, the more people will see it. It's so funny in doing my research on algorithms and social media governance. I feel like I've for a long time looked at the algorithm as this evil entity that's forcing things down our throats, when in reality, it's doing its job. We're just not using it correctly. I think that's what needs to happen is really realizing that there are tools there that are definitely being used against us, but that can just as easily be used for our own use as well. We just need to tap into it. So reposting, commenting, just even like an emoji or a thumbs up or something, just so there's interactions with the media that you want to be boosted, sending it in a private message to someone. All of those things are ways that the algorithm picks up and says, oh, this is something that people want to see. I'm going to push it to more people. Specifically on TikTok, if something doesn't get, I think it's like 100 views in the first 60 seconds, it stops pushing it to people. So you want to get something to that 100 views and then to the 1,000 views and to the 10,000 views. If it's really important, you need that kind of coverage and that kind of visibility on something if you want it to be seen in very short amount of time of it being posted. So reposting is a really important thing. Same with Instagram stories, same with Facebook. That's definitely how I would encourage people outside of the queer community. Inside the queer community, just let's stop tearing people down. There's a lot of queer people, a lot of queer artists that I don't like, but it doesn't mean I have to go around shouting about them. And I've done a fair amount of that in my younger times, and I've now realized it's very useless. There are certain queer music artists that I don't enjoy their music, but I'm not going to go around tell people, oh, don't listen to this. That's terrible music. Because I want queer people to get the platform. Doesn't mean that I need to listen to it, but I don't have to go and tell other people not to listen to it. Now, there are certain people that, yes, if they're being problematic and they're pushing things that are not okay, I absolutely will call them out because they're part of my community and I'm allowed to call out people within my community who are not acting correct. But if it's just a matter of an opinion on someone's art, who cares? No one cares about your opinion. If you like it, you like it. If you don't. Like, just go with it. Let a queer person win for once.
Well, and let a queer person win for once. I love it. Well, and what I hear in that, because there's a lot of, I'll say this in a tongue-in-cheek way, but there's a lot of like fun cattiness in the queer community, right? Mm-hmm. Like that's part of the fun. It's almost like the gossip discussion. It's like, oh, what is she wearing and what is she doing and that kind of thing. And so what it sounds like you're saying is perhaps there's a way to evolve that so still can be the fun.
That can still happen in real life. The problem is I think younger generations have forgotten that people's lives aren't lived online. We are not electronic beings. We're electrical beings, but we're not electronic beings. And so if you're having some of these conversations online or making some of these comments online, tone does not come across. It doesn't. Text does not allow that. We are evolving text. Emojis are evolving. Images are evolving. This is what I'm studying in my thesis, is how do we get these things across through a social media platform and allow people to like get in on the joke. But I think that's where people need to kind of take a step back and realize this could be misinterpreted. Is it necessary for me to say this right now? And it's not about self-censorship. I don't believe in self-censorship. It's about social media. You unfortunately have to think about optics. Unfortunately, it's a thing. And there are people out there who are waiting for a queer person to shit on another queer person so they can start shitting on them too. It's knowing there are people waiting to tear us down. And if we give them any kind of a foothold at this present moment, they will take it. It doesn't mean that it'll be like that forever, but we have to let things evolve to the point where we can make some of those jokes again.
The last thing that you just said was super interesting, and I thought it was a segue into whether or not you're ready for a couple of questions, like our rapid fire questions.
Let's do it.
Are you? Okay. So
I'm probably not, but let's do it.
All right. No, but this is really easy. This is really easy. So have fun with this. What's your favorite movie or TV show that makes you feel or think about resilience?
I have a lot of answers for that. But I think the one that always comes to mind, my go-to movie when I'm having a tough day and want to just like have a mug of tea and just like sit and feel good, is specifically the 1997 version of Little Women. Don't get me started on Greta Gerwig. I could go on for 3 hours about her.
Okay.
But the 1997 version of Little Women, and it's because it's a story about queerness that was written at a time when you couldn't be queer, and so she had to change the ending to make the lead character not look queer. But ultimately, all of the characters deal with the worst things that you could deal with and find community and find those ways to be resilient as they move forward. So that's a movie that I honestly have probably mostly memorized at this point.
Oh, that's a beautiful example. All right. So now tell us, what's your favorite song that makes you feel resilient?
See, this one's a hard one. This is way harder than movies. Because I'm a musician. So music, I have to go through an entire library of music in my mind. So I think I'm going to cop out and not go with a specific song, but I'm going to say, again, the music that helps me get through tough days and tough times. Like when I was sitting in New York, just after like a 18-hour work day on the subway home, I would always turn on Christmas music. And I know Christmas music is not for everyone, but it could be boiling hot. I could be sweating my ass off. And that's the only thing that's going to get me better. Specifically, Kelly Clarkson's Christmas albums.
Oh, yeah.
Yes.
Wrapped in Red will always pick up my spirits in a heartbeat.
I love it. And I know Jen does too. I can see her reaction.
Because you said you would do it for money, we're going to have to hire you to do your drag acts to Kelly Clarkson's album. I'm booking you. That's it.
Oh, yeah.
Easy.
Oh, yeah. Christmas special, Resiliency, the podcast. Here we come.
I'm ready.
wait.
I'm here for it.
Oh, that's super. Okay. It's a deal. What's one last thing that made you laugh? Like laugh out loud, laugh, crazy laugh.
It has been hard finding laughs recently just because I've been studying a lot of really heavy stuff and in the classroom a lot. And cities are not my favorite thing in the planet, no matter what country I'm in. So laughing has been hard to come by. So I turned to one of my favorite shows, and I'm rewatching it for probably the 5th or 6th time. So it's The Marvelous Mrs. Maisel. It is so well written. And I'm a Gilmore Girls fan too. Anything Amy Sherman Palladino does is brilliant. But there's just something about The Marvelous Mrs. Maisel that they hit there's so many great one-liners, there's so many great monologues, the situations are just so ironic and beautiful. So I've been watching that a lot this last week and just laughing out loud to myself in my apartment. I'm sure my neighbor thinks that I'm going completely crazy at this point.
No, you're in Paris. They don't care. Listen, I lived there 3 years. They don't care. You're fine.
I also lived there 2.5 years. They do care if you're American. Just FYI.
Okay, all right.
Okay.
I'm not trying to speak French,
Right.
so they're okay with it.
That's true. It's like, it's your inside voice laugh or your outside voice laugh. Depends.
You know, it depends on the episode.
Okay. Love it. What's a question that you would like to leave for a future guest?
If you were a kind of cookie, what would you be and why? And the why is an important one in that question.
Okay.
I'm in love with that question.
Okay.
I'm already like answering it in my head and I'm going through a lot of cookies.
Yeah.
Great question, Ira. Great question.
I used to be a camp counselor. I had to come up with questions like that all the time.
I love it.
What color would your lightsaber be? If you were a shoe, what would you be? Yes. Icebreakers are the best kinds of questions.
I'm like, I'm an Oreo because I'm sweet and gushy on the inside. You know, I'm just thinking it through.
But then you have to question, what is a cookie? Like, what are you going to accept as an answer? So there's a lot of ways it can go.
Now you're getting into grad school speak.
It's just like, is a hot dog a sandwich? Is a taco a sandwich?
Perspective.
No, but both are delicious.
Yeah. It's about perception and perspective.
And they're not the same thing, right, Dr. C?
Not the same thing. Now, Jen, you need to ask the last question, which is a really cool thing someone in a previous episode left for us.
So this is what we're going to take. We'll take it full circle. We've gone from cookies all the way to, we're talking about legacy. And the question is, what would you say in your epitaph?
Oh, God. I mean, that's hard because I feel like my headstone is going to have to be a joke. Like, it's not going to just be Ira McIntosh, born, died, beloved friend, and whatever. There's going to have to be some kind of joke on it. But an epitaph is so much more heartfelt. Now I'm questioning my question that I asked. Feel bad.
No, yours is great. Don't worry.
Love yours.
I would like to be remembered as someone who cared about themselves as much as they cared about their community, because I think it's really easy to care too much about the people around you and not put care into yourself. So I think in my epitaph, I would like to be remembered as that person who took the time for themselves when they needed to, but then also made sure that there was time for everyone else too.
That's beautiful.
Ira, that's beautiful. It is. Yeah, it's beautiful. And you know what? It's so real to who you are. I want to say a huge thank you for having the bravery, the resilience, the intelligence, the wisdom to be able to tell this story on the TEDx stage and then again today on Resiliency, the podcast. I want to thank you for being so open and honest about all of the things you've experienced. Everything you are doing is speaking exactly to what you just said. You are really guarding and taking care of yourself as you nurture this language you're learning and these communities you're building. And then you're really making a major difference for those who don't understand some of the work that and the ability that they have to make a difference in the world through social media, throughout queer communities, and really on everyone they love. So, Ira, we want to thank you for coming to Resiliency, the podcast. It's been our absolute pleasure. And then to all of our listeners, we want to thank you for being here with us. As always, we ask that you like and subscribe our episode if you have enjoyed this. We certainly hope you do. And we've got more coming for you. So please look us up. You can find Resiliency, the podcast on any station where you like to listen to podcasts. You'll find us on Spotify, Apple, YouTube, etc. You can also find us online at resiliencythepodcast.com. Now, I want to ask our guest today, Mr. Ira McIntosh, where can our listeners find you if they'd like to learn more about the wonderful things you've talked about today?
I mean, surprisingly, for someone who is studying social media and preaching social media, I don't use it a whole lot. But you can find me. I do have a TikTok. I don't post very often, but you will see me commenting my merry little heart out. You can follow my TikTok at An American Gay in Paris. On Instagram, I am just Ira A. McIntosh. There's no A in Macintosh, so I put it before it. And then also, if you want to look at my drag page, I haven't posted there in a while too, because it's been a while since I performed, but you can check her out. That's on Instagram at The Gaborium. That's TheGaborium.
Beautiful. Thank you for sharing so much of yourself, Ira. We will put all of those links into the show notes so that all of our listeners can find you, engage with you, and continue to learn from you as you continue to grow as a historian and just as a wonderful person. You can find me, Jenn Quader, at jennquader.com or online at thesmartagency.com, which is my company, or on all social profiles at Jenn Quader. And then our illustrious and wonderful co-host, Dr. Kelly Culver, you can find her at theculvergroup.ca. That is .ca, because she is the queen of all things Canada. She is also online at drkellyculver.com, and you'll find her at Dr. Kelly Culver on LinkedIn and Instagram. And as always, we just want to say thank you, listeners. This is a place that's really special to our hearts as we share stories, strategies, and inspiration as we all work together to overcome change. So until the next episode, we wish you resilience. We wish you a lot of love and happiness. We'll see you next time.